I am a huge fan of the Nintendo 64, especially the weird third-party releases. Given how poor N64 emulation is on a whole, I find that most of the time, the best way to play a lot of these games is still on an actual N64. Something I personally don't think is true for most other consoles. Even the recent decompilations and recompilations present their own issues in terms of getting an accurate experience. But this limit to good accessibility to N64 games means I get excited anytime an N64 game makes its way to a modern platform in an official capacity, especially when, like Glover, it claims to be built off of the original N64 source code. So it was with glee that I booted up Glover on Switch, and oh, it's bad. Just constantly bad. Why is his face wrong? I'm John Reardon, you're watching NWR TV. Join me as we dig into the Switch port of Glover. If you've never played Glover, think basic 90s 3D platformer meets Super Monkey Ball. You, as a magical glove, must guide a ball, which is actually a transformed magical crystal, through a series of stages so that you can return it to a castle and eventually save the world. I don't consider the original Glover to be a masterpiece by any means, but it's a great example of the experimentation that was being done in game design during this period. So even though I'm not some Glover superfan, it represents exactly what I love about third-party N64 games, and I have a lot of respect for its creativity. This new version is, at some basic level, still Glover. It generally still plays alright, though there are moments where I did feel like the physics were behaving not quite how they should. Still, if your goal is to play Glover by whatever means necessary, this is technically that. That's about the last nice thing that I can say about it. Visually, Glover on Switch is just sort of a disaster. Even as I'm editing this video, I'm noticing new things that I have to add into the voiceover, like this line right here, and I only played through the first world for these comparisons. I can pretty much guarantee that there is more if we keep looking, but we're gonna stop here because I don't want to make this a multi-hour long video. So, let's get started. First up is the changes to lighting. The original N64 version seems to use a single fixed light source, generally placed somewhere up in the sky, and mostly staying still, sort of like a sun or something. For some reason, the new release has this light source tied to the camera, so as the camera moves, it moves, meaning that it will always be directly behind Glover, so Glover is always awkwardly backlit. It also means that the lighting on the actual world geometry is constantly shifting, which only serves to highlight another issue. And this one goes a bit deeper into 3D rendering, and depending on what software you're using may have different names. But creasing, Phong angle limits, UV directions, all of these things factor into the direction a polygon thinks it's facing and how light bounces off of it. On Nintendo 64, these all factored into what Nintendo at the time referred to as geometric anti-aliasing. This is what allowed low polygon objects on the Nintendo 64 to still appear smooth and round, rather than jagged as they often did on the PlayStation. One or more of these things in Glover on Switch is very messed up. As a result, what should be a flat surface will often show odd lighting artifacts, as if one triangle making up the mesh is being lit from a different angle. You can spot it right at the start of the game during the opening cutscene. Look at the castle wall around this window. Or in this early stage, look at these odd triangular artifacts along what should be a flat surface. How about the water in this fountain? This one random section is dark for no apparent reason, and it isn't like that on the Nintendo 64. These crop up often, severely diminishing the original art design. The camera relative lighting only serves to make these errors more evident. But let's go back to that opening cutscene because there sure is a lot more to see there. As I pointed out already, Cross Stitch, the bad guy here, is ironically missing several stitches. This looks like perhaps a UV mapping issue, which would track with the problems we've already seen. But rewind to a bit earlier in this cutscene, and we'll see our first evidence of what will become another recurring issue. Alpha transparencies, such as these plumes of smoke, don't display right on the Switch version. In this instance, they don't seem to be able to overlap, so if you have one alpha transparency behind another one, the one in back will simply disappear. We can see this again in the dust kicked up whenever Glover lands a jump. If we go back to that fountain that we just talked about earlier, there's this low-hanging fog here in this lower section. On Switch, walking into this semi-transparent fog will cause Glover's shadow to disappear, and no dust will appear when he lands a jump, because only the fog, that first level of transparency, can show up. Over on the Nintendo 64, the fog, Glover's shadow, and the dust all exist harmoniously. A couple other quick notes for this area before we leave. On the Switch version, if you hop into the water, Glover's shadow will appear on the top of the water, whereas on the Nintendo 64 it will appear at the bottom where it should. Also, as you're leaving this area, for some reason what should be just total darkness as you exit out this cave is like this weirdly lit texture for some reason. Once again, lighting issues. But going back to the topic of water, we can see in this first stage that the alpha effect being used to create Glover's trail in the water is darkening the water rather than lightening it. You can also see the edges of the actual texture if you look closely, because they're not completely transparent. Another transparency issue can be seen here as we pick up underwater collectibles. The Switch version doesn't display the score popping up from those collectibles when the camera is above the water. Likewise, Glover's shadow, of course, goes missing again. The weird part at this point is actually that the collectibles are visible at all underwater, as they're also alpha transparencies. I don't understand how they're there, but all of these other things aren't. Doesn't make sense to me. Oh well. One final note on transparencies can be seen on Glover himself. His mouth should fade smoothly into the rest of his face, but on Switch, the edges of the texture for his mouth are not transparent and result in an odd, harsh border. Oh, and also during this boss fight, this shockwave effect is just totally broken. Until I went back to check the N64 version, I wasn't totally sure what this effect was even supposed to be. But if you were worried that texture issues would be limited to UV and alpha bugs, no fear, we've got more. Some enemies don't seem to have their textures properly filtered. This results in a sharp, pixelated appearance. Look at this weird shark guy. If we compare his appearance on Switch to how he looks on the Nintendo 64, we can see how nicely his texture was designed to take advantage of the N64's trilinear filtering to give him a nice, clean look. On Switch, the texture's low resolution becomes extremely obvious without any sort of filtering. It's just sharp and pixelated. It looks really bad. And it's strange because it's very inconsistent what enemies will be filtered and what enemies won't. Now, beyond the actual bugs, there are just weird presentational problems. Look at this menu. Look how the added button has just sort of been shoved at the bottom without repositioning the rest of the menu to make room for it. In the video options, you can change the aspect ratio and add some filters, which I was glad to see. That's a good feature I like to see in my retro re-releases. However, the 4:3 aspect ratio adds a brightly colored border that cannot be turned off, which is always a bummer. And then the filters, which consist of scan lines, curve, and smooth, all apply to this border as well, which just looks bizarre. Also, I can't actually figure out what the smooth filter does. I figured it might be an FXAA filter, but I wasn't able to spot any difference with it on or off, so who knows. Oh, and also the game runs at 720p, docked or handheld, the same resolution the Nintendo Switch Online N64 emulator runs its games at, meaning that this game would actually probably look better simply running on Nintendo's own emulator as compared to this source code port. Your source code port has to be pretty bad for Nintendo's N64 emulator to be a better option. Hey, it's John from the future. I was almost done editing this video and then caught a couple other things. One, the demo screen, like the rolling demo if you just leave the game sitting on the title, the button inputs, like the scripted buttons to make Glover run around for that demo, don't work. So most of the time he just sort of like runs into a wall or runs off the edge and then the demo just ends. Don't know how that happened. Also, every time that I have closed the game, like gone out to the Switch home screen and pressed X to actually exit out of the app completely, it has sat on that like closing software screen for a long time and then just actually crashed the game. Like goes to the black screen where it's like an error occurred. I have never closed the game successfully. And that part feels like a legitimate like certification issue. Like I'm surprised that didn't come up with like Nintendo certifying the game. So that's weird. Anyway, thanks. Here's the rest of the video. But that's Glover on Switch. Obviously, I know owning and buying a bunch of N64 games on real hardware isn't the best solution for everyone, and it can get expensive. So I'm glad when these games become available on modern platforms, even with a compromise here and there. But this port of Glover really does a disservice to the original. Booting up the actual N64 cartridge to get these comparisons blew me away in just how much better it looked and even felt running on original hardware. This port just doesn't accurately convey what this game was. As someone who will generally encourage everyone to play weird Nintendo 64 games, including Glover, this port ain't it. This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.